July 17, 2020. Federal Correctional Complex, Terre Haute, Indiana. At 4:36 p.m., Dustin Honken took his final breath via lethal injection, ending one of the most heinous killing sprees in Iowa's criminal history. 27 years after he murdered 5 innocent people, including 2 children, to protect his methamphetamine empire, justice was finally served. This is the story of a drug kingpin who believed he was untouchable, the innocent families destroyed by his greed, and the relentless investigation that brought him to justice nearly 3 decades later. Mason City, Iowa. 1992. In the heartland of America, where cornfields stretch to the horizon and small-town values still mean something, Dustin Honken was building a criminal empire that would leave 5 people dead and an entire community shattered. Honken wasn't your typical street-level dealer. He was intelligent, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Along with his partner Timothy Cutcomp, Honken began manufacturing high-quality methamphetamine in Arizona in 1992, creating a product so pure it commanded premium prices across the Midwest. But manufacturing was only half the equation. Honken needed distribution channels, and for that, he recruited local dealers who knew the Iowa market. 2 men from Mason City became his primary distributors, Greg Nicholson and Terry DeGiss. These weren't hardened criminals. They were small-town men who got in over their heads with a predator who saw human life as nothing more than collateral in his business operations. It was through Terry DeGiss that Honken met Angela Johnson, Terry's girlfriend at the time. What started as a business relationship between Honken and Johnson quickly evolved into something more dangerous, a romantic partnership between 2 people with no moral boundaries. By 1993, Honken's operation was generating massive profits. But with success came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came the one thing Dustin Honken feared more than anything: witnesses who could destroy his empire. The beginning of the end started with what should have been routine law enforcement work. Federal investigators had been monitoring methamphetamine trafficking in Iowa, and Honken's name kept appearing in their intelligence reports. High-purity meth was flooding northeast Iowa, and all roads led back to the same source. When federal agents finally moved to indict Honken on drug trafficking charges, they had a solid case. But cases are built on evidence, and evidence requires witnesses. Greg Nicholson, Honken's own dealer, had agreed to testify against his former boss. In the world of drug trafficking, there's no greater betrayal and no greater threat to a kingpin's freedom. For most people, facing federal drug charges means accepting responsibility and serving time. For Dustin Honken, it meant something entirely different. He had built his empire through violence and intimidation, and he wasn't about to let a few witnesses destroy everything he'd created. Honken was scheduled to be tried on federal drug trafficking charges, with Greg Nicholson as the key witness against him. But Honken had no intention of letting that trial proceed. He had a different plan, one that would eliminate the witnesses and send a message to anyone else who might consider cooperating with law enforcement. What happened next would shock even seasoned investigators and demonstrate just how far a desperate drug kingpin would go to protect his criminal enterprise. July 25, 1993. A summer day in Mason City, Iowa, where families were enjoying the warm weather and children played in yards that had always been safe. Lori Duncan, a 31-year-old single working mother, was trying to build a life for herself and her 2 daughters, 10-year-old Candace and 6-year-old Amber. Lori had recently begun dating Greg Nicholson, the man who had agreed to testify against Dustin Honken. She had no involvement in the drug trade, no knowledge of the deadly game her boyfriend had become entangled in. Her only crime was falling in love with the wrong man at the wrong time. On that July afternoon, Dustin Honken and Angela Johnson arrived at the Duncan home. What happened next was a cold, calculated execution designed to eliminate witnesses and send a message. Lori Duncan, her daughters Candace and Amber, and Greg Nicholson were kidnapped from their home. Later testimony would reveal the horrific details. A cellmate of Honken's testified that Honken had described strangling both Lori Duncan and Greg Nicholson. But perhaps most chilling of all, Honken admitted that he killed the 2 children because they could have been witnesses. 2 little girls, aged 6 and 10, murdered not because of anything they had done, but because a drug kingpin couldn't risk the possibility that they might someday remember faces or voices. In Honken's twisted logic, the lives of innocent children were acceptable casualties in protecting his criminal empire. For months later, Dustin Honken still wasn't satisfied that his secret was safe. On November 5, 1993, Terry DeGiss, 32, of rural Britt, Iowa, was reported missing. DeGius was another potential witness against Honken, and the drug kingpin decided he posed too great a risk. Honken beat DeGius with a baseball bat and shot him to death. 5 people dead. 3 adults who had become entangled in Honken's drug operation, and 2 innocent children whose only crime was being in the wrong place when a killer decided to eliminate witnesses. Honken had earlier informed the judge in his drug case that he would plead guilty at the end of July. But days after the killings, with his witnesses now dead and buried in secret graves, Honken changed his strategy. Without witnesses, the federal case against him collapsed. The drug charges were dismissed. For Dustin Honken, it seemed like the perfect crime. He had literally gotten away with murder, and his meth operation could continue. But what Honken didn't realize was that the families of his victims would never stop looking for answers, and law enforcement would never stop investigating their disappearances. The bodies of Lori Duncan, her daughters, and Greg Nicholson wouldn't be found for 7 years. Terry DeGius's remains wouldn't be discovered until 2000. But when they were finally located, they would tell a story of violence so horrific that even hardened investigators would be shaken to their core. For 7 years, the families of the victims lived in agonizing uncertainty. Lori Duncan's mother never stopped believing her daughter and granddaughters were alive somewhere. Greg Nicholson's family held on to hope that he had simply disappeared to start a new life. Terry DeGius's loved ones searched for answers that seemed impossible to find. But investigators never closed the case. Even as years passed and leads went cold, law enforcement officials in Iowa and federal agents continued working the disappearances. They knew these people hadn't simply vanished, they had been murdered, and they had a prime suspect. The breakthrough came through a combination of new forensic techniques, witness testimony, and the kind of methodical police work that eventually solves even the most carefully planned crimes. The bodies were finally discovered in 2000, 7 years after the murders. The physical evidence, preserved in shallow graves, told the horrific story of what had happened to these innocent people. But evidence wasn't enough. Prosecutors needed witnesses, and finding people willing to testify against a man who had already killed 5 people to silence witnesses presented obvious challenges. That's when investigators got their biggest break. Honken's own cellmates began coming forward with information about his confessions. Prison has a way of loosening tongues, especially when killers want to brag about their crimes. Robert Tokars, who shared a cell with Honken, provided devastating testimony about the killer's confessions. Honken had described in detail how he strangled Lori Duncan and Greg Nicholson, and admitted to killing the children because they could have identified him later. These weren't the rambling stories of a disturbed man. They were detailed confessions that matched the physical evidence perfectly. Honken had described burial locations, methods of murder, and motivations that only the killer would know. But even facing overwhelming evidence, Dustin Honken continued to demonstrate his complete disregard for human life and the rule of law. In 2005, prison officials discovered that Honken was plotting an escape with the help of white supremacists, with plans to murder witnesses who might testify against him. Even from death row, he was still trying to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. The escape plot was foiled by the same cellmate who had testified about Honken's confessions, Robert Tokars, proving that even among criminals, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed, especially when it comes to murdering children. On October 14, 2004, a jury in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Iowa found Dustin Honken guilty of numerous federal offenses, including 5 counts of murder. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was damning, and the jury had no difficulty reaching their verdict. Honken was sentenced to death for killing government informants and children in his effort to thwart his drug trafficking prosecution. 3 death sentences for the adults, and 2 more for the children whose only crime was witnessing their mother's murder. But as any family of murder victims knows, a death sentence is just the beginning of another long journey. Appeals, legal challenges, and the slow machinery of the federal death penalty system meant that justice would be delayed for nearly 2 more decades. For the families of Lori Duncan, Candace Duncan, Amber Duncan, Greg Nicholson, and Terry DeGius, the waiting continued. They had waited 7 years for the bodies to be found, 8 more years for conviction, and would wait 16 more years for the sentence to be carried out. 27 years from murder to execution. A generation of waiting for justice. July 17, 2020. Dustin Lee Honken, now 52 years old, was prepared for execution at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. He received a lethal injection, becoming the 3rd federal prisoner executed that week as the federal government resumed executions after a 17-year hiatus. Even in his final moments, Honken showed no remorse for his crimes, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, no recognition that his victims had been human beings with families who loved them. He had spent 27 years on death row and never once expressed regret for murdering 2 innocent children. Mark Bennett, the federal judge who oversaw Honken's trial, said he generally opposes the death penalty, but that this case was different. The calculated murder of children to prevent them from becoming witnesses crossed every moral and legal boundary. At 4:36 p.m. on July 17, 2020, Dustin Honken was pronounced dead. The man who had built a drug empire on the bodies of innocents, who had murdered children to protect his criminal enterprise, who had shown no mercy to his victims, finally faced the ultimate consequence for his crimes. Today, when we tell the story of Dustin Honken, we must remember that this isn't really a story about him at all. This is a story about 5 innocent people whose lives were cut short by a man who valued money more than human life. Lori Duncan was a single, working mother trying to build a better life for her daughters. Candace Duncan was 10 years old, Amber Duncan was just 6. They were little girls who loved their mother, who played with toys, who had dreams about growing up. They were murdered because a drug dealer was afraid they might remember his face. Greg Nicholson was a man who made a mistake getting involved with drugs, but who tried to do the right thing by cooperating with law enforcement. He paid for that decision with his life. Terry Degius was another small-town man who got in over his head with people far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The Honken case stands as one of the most clear-cut examples of why the death penalty exists in American law. When someone murders children to protect their criminal enterprise, when they show no remorse and continue plotting violence even from death row, society must respond with its ultimate sanction: 27 years from murder to justice. It seems like a long time, but for the families of the victims, no amount of time could truly heal their wounds or bring back their loved ones. The execution of Dustin Honken didn't bring Lori, Candace, Amber, Greg, or Terry back to life, but it did ensure that their killer could never hurt anyone else. The case also serves as a stark reminder of the real cost of the drug trade. It's not just about addiction or overdoses, it's about the violence that surrounds the illegal drug business, the innocent people who get caught in the crossfire, and the lengths that traffickers will go to protect their profits. In small-town Iowa, where neighbors still look out for each other and children should be safe playing in their own yards, Dustin Honken brought a level of violence that shattered an entire community's sense of security. But the same community values that made his crimes so shocking also ensured that justice would eventually prevail. The investigators never gave up. The prosecutors never stopped building their case. The juries did their duty. And finally, after nearly 3 decades, the federal government carried out the sentence that Honken's crimes demanded. In memory of Lori Duncan, Candace Duncan, Amber Duncan, Greg Nicholson, and Terry Degius, 5 innocent people whose lives were taken by evil, but whose memories were honored by justice. Sometimes the wheels of justice turn slowly, but in the end they do turn.